Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces, Part 1, Stratan Dreams, Book 1, Desolation's Tears, read by the author. Chapter 21, Exposed Wounds. 1. By the time they had arrived at their destination, Veslin had regained much of her composure. With the life she'd led thus far, resiliency had long proven one of her more reliable attributes. It helped that Tiff was also calming down, though she remained silent. No one had intercepted them. From the back seat, Merrin suggested that whatever official representatives were enforcing the curfew had most likely been scrambled to the site of the devastation and inferno they and the Kakor had left behind. Even with the weight of her sidearm back in its holster, both Veslin and Tiff still shuddered at the very mention of the name that had been ascribed to the nightmarish monstrosity that had nearly ended their lives. Talitha had remained stoic in the driver's seat, which was impressive as no one had come closer to the creature than she had. She seemed inwardly conflicted between her visceral encounter and the physical improbabilities they'd witnessed her perform. Under it all, Veslin remembered the woman had just wanted to leave the planet as soon as she could. The situation for her had only grown significantly more complicated. The warehouse that housed Redemption's environmental services featured a double-wide garage entry, and once they were inside, Desolation's raging environment would cover their tracks in less than 2 minutes. Dirk shut down the hoverbike and began a systematic evaluation of the interior, paying close attention to the few windows and the rafters of the cavernous interior. Dr. Havrel Sintel was still riding the adrenaline high of his own stress.
Welcome,
he said awkwardly.
We're not really used to having guests here. The lab is certainly no hotel, but please, make yourselves at home.
Sintel seemed to be counting heads as he shuffled around the garage nervously.
This facility hasn't been fully staffed since before I was born, but there should be plenty of cots in storage.
Raish stepped off the transport's right side runner, allowing Merrin to exit from the rear seat door. As he unshouldered the backpack of payday shells, he unhooked the feed to the crowd pleaser like a trained professional. Popular media had long reinforced the idea that the AR-500K still held 500 microshells in its magazine, even when detached from its backpack feed. But Veslin didn't know whether that was true or a media creation. Merrin still appeared to be shaken up, but as she had nothing to compare the older man to, she didn't know if this was his normal state. One hand would sporadically tremble as with a palsy, and he would close his eyes and breathe in slow, measured breaths until he'd willed stability back into his rebellious limb. She suspected that however he behaved normally, his current disposition was the direct result of their recent encounter. Merrin made one such reclamation of his composure, and, seemingly steeling himself, then turned around to address Raish. Excuse me, sir. Mr. Merrin began. Raish, is it? Raish didn't answer, but swiveled his head so the mirrored goggles on his helmet reflected Merrin's face back at him. I wanted to thank you for your efforts As we faced that hideous beast, Merrin said, as if hoping the flight-suited figure would give him something to work off of. We are, all of us, I believe, speaking for myself at least, that I am in your debt. Raish didn't respond for several heartbeats, until his outer speakers stated, "Yes, you are." He held the crowd-pleaser and backpack in separate arms and walked away from the speechless Merrin. Tiff was slow in climbing out of the transport, as if testing each handhold, each footstep, before entrusting her weight to it. With his shoulders hunched in concern, Sintel approached the girl cautiously.
"We have a kitchen,"
he said, dividing his focus between Tiff and Veslin.
"Maybe something to eat, drink? If it's there, it's yours."
Veslin offered appreciatively, "I think I'm speaking for all of us here. Thanks for opening your doors." Sintel seemed grateful for the acknowledgement, but he was still flustered.
"The door,"
he muttered to himself. Veslin glanced around to see if she'd accounted for everyone. Talitha remained aboard the transport, her stance suggesting she'd placed one foot on the runner, the other still inside the vehicle, as if she'd not yet decided upon a course of action. Her eyes were dark, her brow furrowed, lips pursed in what seemed an expression of bitterness, anger, or both. Veslin had never known her friend Tal very well. Now, she felt like she didn't really know her at all. "Hey, Tal," Veslin called. "Would you like to join us? I think we're all coming down off of, well, whatever that was." Talitha closed her eyes, then lowered her head as if coming to a decision. After an extended moment, she climbed down from the open cab and shut its door behind her. If for nothing else, Veslin smiled at the decision. 2. Tiff screamed. Veslin ran from the garage into the adjoining storeroom where Tiff had followed Dr. Sintel only moments earlier en route to the kitchen. Scattered about, resting on half-opened storage crates, leaning against shelves and propped up against the walls, were the artistic renderings of the horror they'd only just left behind. Standing in the aisle between crates, Tiff had lowered her head into her hands. Sintel steadied her by the shoulders, and he looked around for anyone who might be better suited to take over from him. Veslin recognized Tiff's posture as more one of embarrassment than trauma. Oddly, Merrin suggested that Dr. Sintel lock the office door. Sintel nodded, added that the front door needed tending to as well, then passed responsibility for Tiff's stability to Veslin as she approached. The images surrounding them weren't anatomically accurate. They were expressions, ideas, an effort to capture the last vestiges of a nightmare before it faded from waking memory. Veslin couldn't understand why anyone would ever want to commit such horror to posterity. She noticed Merrin would not look at the scattered imagery, not quite as if he'd already seen them, but more so that after encountering the living personification, he could no longer bring himself to look upon them again. Talitha gave the imagery a wide assessment, as if she was now qualified to judge which facets were the literal truth and which were impressions from the imagination. Raish was the most clinical, going from document to document, image to image, and staring at them intently. Veslin thought his helmet might have cameras recording details for later review. Sintel had pointed the way to the kitchen before he'd slipped away to attend the front door and whatever wasn't to be seen in the office. So Veslin guided Tiff toward warmer lighting than the cold illumination of the storeroom. 3. Dirk was rummaging through cabinets, revealing a wide variety of processed meal mixes. Scientists working overnight and weekends at the lab typically didn't have the time to be connoisseurs. But Veslin knew the offerings aboard the Lucky Strike were better than these dehydrated grains. "Can a guy get a drink around here?" Dirk asked loud enough that those in other rooms might hear him. He smiled at those nearby and actually joked, "Hey, I know I can always reopen the garage door and bring in a couple of snowballs to melt. Only..." He smirked and looked askance, as if knowing he was being provocative. "We don't know what else I might let in." He seemed to have rebounded from their encounter the fastest. With a touch of rebuke, Merrin replied, "That isn't funny. And we're going to need something to secure that main door." "There's plenty of things in here to barricade it with," Dirk said with an air of apology. "I can get on that just as soon as we're done in here." Dr. Sintel's voice carried into the kitchen moments before he returned in person.
"We've an ample supply and a wide variety. In that supply cabinet in the corner,"
he added with a gesture as he entered the room. The two-door cabinet was steel, rusted at the bottom. There were still scraped ruts in the floor from where it had been dragged into that corner over a century before, and looked as if it should contain beakers and jars. Dirk turned the pair of quaint handles and opened the doors to reveal a drunkard's paradise. Sintel mirrored Dirk's congeniality.
"For those of you not native to Desolation, it gets pretty cold around these parts."
"And your season of deepest winter is fast approaching," Merrin emphasized, seemingly lost in another dark thought. Sintel still smiled.
"That's right. Frozen hell. Not for the uninitiated,"
he added for those who might be unfamiliar.
"It'll be here in another 2 days, give or take 16 hours.
Merrin took a seat, staring at the floor with intense concentration. The Kakor cannot be allowed into the underground for those 5 months. There was silence. Veslin felt herself shudder. Tiff stared at the ceiling. Dirk snapped the spell. "So, who wants a drink?" He was looking straight at Veslin. She declined. "I'm not taking another drink for the rest of my life." In her head, it sounded sincere. She saw Dirk turn toward Tiff, and she was quick to intervene. "And Tiff's only 14. For an instant, the girl lowered her head to stare at her, and then she swiftly rolled her eyes.
"I'll take one,"
Sintel said, raising his hand.
"And we've got imported cocoa we can heat up."
He was gesturing toward Tiff, and the girl nodded. Dirk scanned the room, his gaze shifting between Talitha and Merrin. He seemed at a momentary loss and then asked, "Talitha?" Talitha was again silent when directly queried. Contemplative, but then she nodded her head. Merrin said, "I'll pass." My own case of nerves is one that I must overcome myself without the aid of outside stimulants or depressives. He suddenly glanced about the room as if agitated. Has anyone seen where our Mr. Raish has gotten to? He doesn't appear to have followed us. As they looked around the room, locking curious eyes with one another before moving on, Dirk poured Talitha a short glass of something amber-colored. Talitha advanced, ignored the proffered glass, but took the bottle instead. There, in the middle of the encircling group, she raised the bottle and drained half of it in several successive gulps. It was only then that Veslin finally took in her friend's physical appearance. They had all noticed the sliced parka, but her multi-pocketed utility pants were in ribbons, plastered to her skin with blood. There were swaths of exposed skin, and between bands of her pale flesh were dark gashes that seeped blood. With the bottle raised above Tal's head, Tiff gasped at the sight of the tattered clothing that barely hid her bloody abdomen. Even her sleeves were turning crimson. She'd left a slick trail across the floor. Veslin suddenly realized that everyone in the room had witnessed Talitha perform something that should not have been physically possible. I recovered your sword, Dirk said haltingly. I left it back in the garage. It's got that thing's gook all over it. Talitha finished her last gulp, then lowered the bottle, looking down at the evidence of her recent struggle. Obscured by the ribbons of fabric and her own blood, her clothing was soaked in a dark, viscous oil. Raish entered the room and stated bluntly, "The glistening of its carapace is an oil it secretes to lubricate its joints, which indicates the creature doesn't remain in any one spot without leaving a puddle to indicate where it's been. Thus, it doesn't rest, it doesn't nest, and one probably doesn't want to be in close proximity to it for long." Talitha glared and used the bottle in her hand like a pointer toward Raish. "I want you and your ship to get me off this planet tonight." "You must be mistaken," came Raish's modulated reply. "I have no ship." Talitha stared at him, and Veslin sensed her fury begin to simmer just beneath the surface. "You told me you had a ship." "I did," Raish said without moving. "Then where is it? What were you offering me?" "I told you what you wanted to hear." Talitha seethed. "You lied to me." "Never," Raish intoned. "If I told you I had a ship, then it must have been true at the time." The moment froze like a silent tableau, wherein Veslin was sure every soul present stopped whatever they were doing and focused themselves 100% on what was unfolding before them. Veslin couldn't escape her own memories of her friend, Tal, unleashing herself against the Kakor, followed by Raish saving them all with his ill-gotten AR-500K crowd-pleaser. Raish added, "You were grateful for my efforts when I drove off the Kakor." Talitha threw the half-empty bottle at Raish's head where it shattered against his helmet, the alcohol splashing across his flight-suited form, head to toe. Raish never moved. Talitha's breath rose and fell. Her wounds reopened. Her arms, legs, and abdomen glistened red with fresh seepage. Veslin could have sworn she felt hatred emanating from Talitha as if it were something tangible, something she might collect in a cup and drink from until she was satisfied.
I was only saving your life,
Raish said.
the first time.
Sintel tried to diminish the building tension by saying,
Every lab has a medkit. Standard under the Directorate pre-Comfed. It's old stuff, but it still works.
Veslin intervened. Tal. No reaction. Talitha, Veslin reiterated. You're my friend. Please, let me help you. Talitha tensed once more, and those present held their breath. But then she seemed to release it, eyes closed, her head drooping as if conceding to the inevitable. Veslin approached tentatively and gently took Talitha's arm. It was still upraised after having thrown the bottle. Veslin slowly ran her hand along Tal's forearm to her still open palm, where she clasped their fingers together. Don't let Tiff see you like this, Veslin whispered. Come with me. They locked eyes. Veslin didn't flinch. Let me clean you up, bind those wounds, get you a fresh set of clothes from... She faltered. Sintel chimed in.
We've got lab coats, skin suits. One of the lab techs before me, tall woman, she left a suitcase full of clothes decades ago. Whatever you need.
Talitha exhaled, and Veslin felt the last of the night's tension finally ebb away. The pair lowered each other's arms. I'm sorry I couldn't do more, Talitha said, and it seemed to be addressed to all of them, filled with bitterness and remorse. Raish could claim what credit he might, but as far as Veslin was concerned, it was Talitha that had saved each and every one of them. She had nothing to apologize for. Veslin felt it was her honor to escort Talitha from the room. She and Tiff exchanged glances, and Tiff gave her a supportive smile. Veslin mused. That had to count for something. 4. Their departure left an uncomfortable silence. Dirk felt that no one was willing to address the greater mystery. For certain, the creepy-crawly Kakor thing defied explanation, along with the reality that there were ancient records in the other rooms supporting a legend that none of them had ever heard of before. But for Dirk, the even more shocking reveal was Talitha's extraordinary battle with the creature. Dirk prided himself on his own brawling skills, and he was confident in his ability to take care of himself. He'd had to do so for most of his life, and he'd risen to the top of his profession. Only now, 2 encounters had rattled everything he'd ever believed before coming to this frozen rock. Merrin's impractical compassion and Talitha's staggering physical prowess. In Dirk's experience, both were impossible extremes. But like the Kakor, each was now a reality he couldn't explain. He would still keep a close watch on Merrin until he could either pin down the old man's truth or call him out on his hypocrisy. But Talitha's display was something they could and should be talking about. Am I the only one who still can't believe what we all witnessed earlier? Dirk asked.
I think we all want to know more about the Kakor,
Dr. Sintel replied. Dirk shook his head and waved his hand. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that woman who just walked out of here. Raish swiveled his helmeted head to focus exclusively on Dirk. You should rest, Merrin advised him. Dirk was exasperated by the evasion. Can we talk about what we saw her do? I think you should leave Tal alone, said Tiff, surprising them all.
At some point, Sintel interrupted, Comfed is going to demand some answers from me, and I'm not going to have anything to give them.
Sintel looked around to see if he could garner any support for his own apprehensions, and found none.
For all we know, more of Onath's goons are going to show up and want to know what happened to the previous group.
Merrin's focus remained elsewhere. There is more to this core than whatever surface facts might interest a government or a criminal overlord. Dirk realized the man who had so impressed him was still rattled, and he'd learned enough about him in the last day to recognize this was not Merrin's norm. It was enough to give Dirk pause. I did not sleep last night, Merrin revealed, but I would advise we should all be at our peak efficiency for whatever tomorrow may bring. Merrin stood and asked Sintel about the facility's security. Besides barricading the front door, Sintel confirmed that, like most of Redemption, there were subfloors that gave access to the underground tunnel network that kept the city connected throughout the deepest winter. They would need to unblock the access first, but then he could rig the facility's alarm to alert them of any illicit entry and give them an opportunity to escape if necessary. Nothing about Merrin suggested he would take anybody at their word where security was concerned, so he volunteered to assist in whatever was required before formally ending his evening. As he wished them all a good night before exiting after Sintel, Merrin added, There will be much to discuss once the morning arrives. That left Dirk, Tiff, and the enigma that was Raish. 5. Talitha allowed herself to be guided by Veslin to an otherwise empty lab. She was no stranger to places like this. Her job at information retrieval and storage had served as a laboratory of sorts for pure data. Her job to collect, assess, collate, and submit her findings to another in the chain of authority. She'd also worked as a lab tech in one of her previous guises. Talitha had discovered she could fake just about any area of expertise. She would then assimilate the necessary data to master the job requirements faster than any of her human counterparts. Veslin grabbed a medkit from a shelf, and she grimaced at the accumulated dust that appeared to cover every available surface. Thankfully, everything in their intended theater of operation was covered in protective synth cloth draping. Talitha peeled herself out of the shredded parka. The blood-saturated strips that had glued themselves to her arms were agony to rip free. Only she'd learned long ago that just because one felt pain did not mean she had to reveal it if it might be used to determine a weakness. Her inner layer could no longer be removed traditionally, as it was so tattered and with how severely gunked up the metal clasps and zippers were from the Kokor's secretions. Talitha grabbed hold of the collar opening and began a slow, steady rip down the front of her body. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" Veslin exclaimed. Talitha looked over and Veslin was pulling sharp instruments from the medkit. "Let me cut you out of that," Veslin said, walking over with both a scalpel and a pair of scissors. As Veslin reached for a scrap of the fabric, Talitha stopped her. "Are you sure? I don't want you near me with a blade if you've been drinking all day." Veslin's weary eyes gave a skeptical glance beneath Talitha's somber brow. "Don't mess with me when I've got scissors in my hand." Talitha grinned, and it felt liberating if only for the moment. She held her expression until Veslin joined her, and then both began to laugh. "I'm sorry that all of this has happened to you, Vez," Talitha offered. "You had nothing to do with it," Veslin acknowledged. "And if you hadn't come looking for help when you did, well, I don't want to even think about where me and Tiff would be right now." "Do you want to talk about any of it?" Talitha asked. Veslin shook her head and began assessing Talitha's bloody landscape. "I want to get you fixed up the best I can. Do something right by somebody else for a change." Veslin gritted her teeth and exposed one half of them in a lopsided scowl as she began to cut away at the blood-soaked fabric. 6. Once those in the kitchen were down to 3, each a stranger to the other 2, Dirk watched Raish go to the sink and grab a clean washcloth. He expected the flight-suited figure to dampen it to wipe the alcohol from his helmet. Instead, without a word, Raish knelt and used the dry cloth to wipe up Talitha's blood from the floor. Tiff had finished pouring the cocoa powder into the heated water and was stirring the mixture, still remaining attentive to both of her companions as she snagged one of the 5 chairs that accompanied 2 tables. Dirk sidled past the kneeling Raish, giving him a sidelong glance to size up whether or not he could take the thin figure in a fight, as long as the guy was unarmed. Dirk had no problem cheating if he had to, but he wasn't going to let anyone else get the drop on him if he couldn't ensure the odds beforehand. Dirk returned to the cabinet and poured himself a fresh drink. "Hey, Raish," Dirk said. "How did you get your hands on a crowd pleaser? Those things are strictly military issue." Without looking up, Raish answered,
Your overcompensation is both shallow and predictable.
"Excuse me?"
Your intelligence, as exhibited thus far, indicates you should possess sufficient understanding to take my meaning.
Raish had angered Talitha, a woman even Dirk was leery of antagonizing. And now, here he was trying to goad him into a similar reaction. Dirk looked at the empty glass in his hand and contemplated if it might prove an effective projectile against Raish's helmet. He decided the risk of a ricochet harming the girl was enough to not take the chance. Instead, Dirk said, "I asked a simple question about your gun." Raish continued his cleanup effort without even looking at Dirk as he replied,
Yours was a thinly veiled allusion to the comparative size of our firearms.
Dirk snapped, "I was trying to thank you for saving us earlier." Tiff just watched as she took a sip of her cocoa. Raish stood and said,
You have been sizing me up since our arrival here. to determine which of us could get the drop on the other first.
It was Dirk's jaw that dropped.
You're willing to cheat,
Raish added.
but you want to be sure that I won't before you make your move.
Dirk thought Raish had to be one of those damn Etherian telepaths. The physique should have been a dead giveaway, only Dirk hadn't considered it until now. The flight suit was probably to make sure he wasn't toppled by a sudden gust of wind.
I'm no Etherian,
Raish said.
and I'm no telepath.
Really? Dirk said with a smirk, getting angrier that Raish wouldn't face him, show him the respect he deserved.
If I believed you actually knew what I was, I would have to kill you. Talitha is the only reason the both of you are still alive.
Raish headed for one of the exits from the kitchen. Dirk thought what he said meant they owed Talitha a more obvious thanks for having distracted the creature enough so Raish could finish the job, which he hadn't. But there was something unsettling in his minimalist manner that suggested something darker. Dirk didn't appreciate being threatened either. Not by his father back in the Corinthia days, and most definitely not today, no matter how obscurely it was presented. Dirk took a step, positioning himself so that Tiff wouldn't see his sleight of hand. "Hey, Raish," Dirk called, not hiding the contempt in his voice. Raish turned, as cold and smoothly as he did everything. Dirk's mini pistol had slipped from its hiding place and rested in his palm. Not good for an open battle, and not powerful enough to put a dent in the Kokor's carapace, but perfect for moments like this. Up close, personal, and when surprise was most definitely on Dirk's side. Dirk didn't fire. He only mouthed the word, bang, so Tiff wouldn't hear. Raish didn't react in any obvious way. After a moment's hesitation, he raised his own hand in the form of a finger gun.
Bang!
Raish reciprocated, loud enough for Tiff. He left the youngest two to their own devices. Tiff spoke first. He didn't wash or throw away that rag. "He's a shikin' weirdo is what he is," Dirk muttered bitterly. Tiff took another sip. "That smells good," Dirk said. "Would you like some?" Tiff asked. 7. "How about you?" Veslin asked as she cut Talitha's shredded and blood-matted clothing away. "It isn't every day that women like us have our worlds turned upside down." Talitha couldn't prevent the emotional reaction that tensed all her muscles at once. Veslin seemed to realize she'd pricked a sore spot, and not with the blades in her hands. She changed course into what she obviously didn't recognize was equally dangerous territory. "That mystery man in the flight suit has the hots for you," she said. Talitha opted to let the minor transgression pass. She moaned, and there was no pleasure suggested. "There's something unnerving about him," Talitha shuddered. "I don't like dealing with things I don't understand." "Then you're 2 for 2 tonight, my dear." Talitha felt her upper torso exposed, and Veslin gasped. Not at her nakedness or at what humans considered perfection, but at the chunks of meat that had been literally sliced away from her arms. Slivers ripped through skin and muscle, as well as the gouge across her left side that exposed her abdomen muscles, leaving shredded strands hanging out from the wound. "Does that hurt?" Veslin asked, suddenly reluctant to advance any further. "It does," Talitha conceded. "Quite a bit, actually. But I can choose whether to express it or not." Veslin was taken aback. "Are you a machine?" "No, not at all. I'm flesh and blood, just like you." "But you're not human." Talitha didn't answer. 8. Tiff had refused to make Dirk's cocoa for him, while the boy had tried passing off his offensive suggestion that doing so was a woman's job as a mere joke. Only the girl wasn't buying it. He realized she had it together better than any of them would have guessed. She was also smarter than she let on, and Dirk realized she had probably bounced back faster than any of the others, including himself. She seemed to be content sitting on the outskirts of most social interactions and observing where everyone else was coming from. Dirk had a problem with being assessed too closely. It didn't matter if the conclusions drawn might even be factually correct. It was the very act of anybody standing in judgment over him that he refused to abide. He decided it would be better for all involved if he turned those tables and put somebody else in the crosshairs. "So, how'd you get the nickname Tiff, anyway?" Dirk asked with a playful chide in his voice. "Did you get caught cheating somebody at cards?" Tiff's mood darkened abruptly. "It's not a nickname." Dirk exaggerated his reaction to keep the emphasis on her. "Hey, don't snap!" Her brow furrowed as she stared at him. "I didn't snap." "You did. I just asked a question." Tiff released the tension in her face and looked down. "I'm sorry." Dirk saw his opening and joined her at the table. "Hey, that's okay," he said, keeping his voice light and unthreatening. "Your name's just unusual is all, but I think it's kinda neat. I think it suits you." She glared at him again. "What, that I'm a cheat? You don't know me." Dirk threw up his hands in a display of social ineptitude. "Oh man, that's not what I meant. It's my turn to apologize. I'm so sorry." Tiff seemed to accept his sincerity. "Yes, tiff is a gambling term," Dirk clarified. "Actually, it's a term for cheating at cards, but I look at you, and I see somebody who's obviously cheating at life and hasn't been caught yet." He saw her eyes soften. He grinned as he added, "I mean, look at what happened tonight. If anybody cheated fate and came out the winner, it was you." She matched his smile. In that moment, Dirk knew he had to score. Tiff blushed and whispered, "It's short for Tiffitas." She made a face, sticking out her tongue and crossing her eyes. "It's awful." Dirk whispered back, "I think it's beautiful." 9. In the awkward silence, Veslin appeared unsure as to what she should do next, what to say, while also conveying a reluctance to administer aid to wounds that were so obviously beyond her minimal skill with cuts and bruises. "It's not as much of a problem as you think," Talitha encouraged. "If anything is sticking out, just put it back in. Sew me up and then cover the skinless spots with the burn salve and tape it over. Veslin looked skeptical. My body will take care of the rest. Veslin was still shaken. You're acting like this has happened before. Talitha was calm. It has. Worse than this. I'll be fine. Veslin resumed cautiously, cutting through Talitha's pants and snipping the waistband of her panties. Peeling away the fabric from her legs, nearly every wound had strands that had been caught within by the piston motions of her own movement. Despite her claims to the contrary, Talitha winced as every frayed strip adhered to her skin by drying blood was slowly tugged from the gaps in her flesh. Talitha's lower half was in worse shape than the upper, yet Veslin seemed mesmerized by the specimen that had entrusted itself to her care. Talitha had been designed to be admired, leered at, and even lusted over, to elicit desire or to inspire. But none of it mattered to her. The emotional reactions of naturally born biological machines, whose physical prime could be measured in a hand count of decades before their inevitable deterioration kicked in. She'd already watched so many humans come and go around her, while she hadn't even racked up her first century. She found it difficult to respect them. Veslin pursed her lips and made a deliberate show of turning her head away. She returned to the medical kit and sprinkled some antiseptic solution into a bucket of warm water. With a wet cloth, she started with Talitha's face, tenderly wiping away the bloody smudges that had streaked her cheeks and trailed down her neck. 10. Tiff was in mid-story. It's not like he was my real father, but he should have been. Her voice was quiet, soft, and somber. Dante took the job because if it had worked, we'd have been able to clear up all our debts and get our home base off of Desolation. Since prompting the story, Dirk had slipped away from the table only once to make them both a second mug of hot cocoa. Now he sat in rapt fascination as Tiff filled in all the gaps in the narrative. So Tal came to the hangar, Tiff continued, and she got Vez to open up about stuff I couldn't. But I bet you did your best, Dirk encouraged. She smiled and took the back of his hand as if drawing strength from his presence. My parents drank too, Dirk added. Got themselves so shikin' drunk sometimes they couldn't even climb out of bed. I always tried to stay out as long as I could because whenever I finally did come home, my dad would take his frustration out on my hide. He felt her lithe hand clutch at his just a bit tighter. Dirk wished this was another of his lies, but he knew he'd just be lying to himself if he chose to embrace that. I'm going on too much, and you don't want to hear my sob stories, he said. But I do, she replied. Later. Finish yours first. She sighed wistfully. That was it. Veslin took Tal out to try and wrangle her a flight, and Flint's goons came to the hangar looking for the cargo. That Kokor thing, I guess. Dirk felt her shudder at the memory the mere mention of the creature invoked. She lowered her head. He slid his chair closer, and she didn't resist. He put his free arm around her shoulder. When she didn't look back up, he pulled his other hand out from under hers and reclaimed his bottle. He held the open spout just above her still steaming cocoa. "Would you like a little splash of this?" he asked. He could feel her warmth. Tiff looked up, and a tear had rolled down each cheek. Her eyes glistened as her lips quivered between her grief and a smile. "No one has to know," she said. Dirk poured, perhaps a little more than he should have. 11. Talitha was appreciative of the care being shown. Veslin had few friends, one less now than she'd had yesterday. She owed Talitha nothing, yet she was making amends through her actions to those she could no longer make her peace with directly. Talitha felt Veslin's thoughts could be steered in directions more beneficial to the both of them. "So, this Kakor," Talitha began her effort, "is most likely the cargo the Lucky Strike was hired to acquire?" Veslin took a deep breath, and Talitha sensed her comportment tighten. "I believe," Veslin started hesitantly, "that's the thing that killed Dante." That wasn't where Talitha wanted Veslin to go. Then this Flint operative wanted the Kakor in some kind of power grab between Onath and his wife? "Tesa," Veslin confirmed. "Organized crime," Talitha pondered. "And they're not bound by whatever mandates or restrictions are coming down from Desolation Central. What are you getting at?" Talitha took her own deep breath. "Illegal or not, they'll have their own ships. Something they can't report stolen after I take one." Veslin gasped. It took Talitha a moment to register that Veslin had stopped tending to her, and that it had nothing to do with the conclusion she'd drawn. "That apprehension code Onath's thugs were chiding you about?" Veslin trailed off in disbelief. She'd been cleaning Talitha's right shoulder and stopped at the discovery of a brand etched just above the highest gash that stretched across her bicep. Talitha had forgotten she still had something to hide. "Run, but you'll never run far enough." Beneath Veslin's fingers were raised letters and numerals that scarred her friend's shoulder, imprinting her flesh like corporate property. AF6134025. "My father told me about these when I was a child," Veslin said, her eyes widening with the implications of her revelation. It was Talitha's turn to tighten her own comportment. "You're a Kogue!" This has been Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces. Book 1, Desolation's Tears. Read by the author. Audio and video production by A.J. Blackburn. Original music composed and performed by Frankie Caffrey. Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces and BJLG's Dark Spaces are copyright 2022 by Bryan J.L. Glass.